Chapter 7 The Woman The woman felt no shame following the lone wolf. After all, he had saved her from the new rebels back in the city. She did not even know at that time that he was called Lone Wolf. By the new common laws, if you saved somebody's life, you owned it and were responsible for them. She shuddered at the thought of her head in the head graveyard and her flesh bursting in the fire. And she shuddered again, thinking back to when the dark man came into their presence. He told them to call him Bast. When Bast first came among them, they had been starving. The summer of storms was past, and the summer of plagues was close to its end. It had been a horrible 2 years. The city got the full brunt of the storms. The family had drowned in the first storm. It had made a direct hit on Virginia Beach, then moved up the coast. They had refused to leave their sound front property, even after they had been warned several times. As always, when hurricanes were predicted to hit, they boarded up the windows and sandbagged around the upper middle class house on the water. They had collected all of the candles and storm lanterns and emergency supplies and placed them in an accessible place. The house was well stocked with canned food and bottled water. Then they settled in, waiting for the storm to come. They did not really expect it to give them a direct hit. They were in the 30% probability area, and it was a Category 5 storm. They were watching the continuing coverage on the news when the first reports came in that the storm had made landfall and it had hit Virginia Beach instead of Naeg's Head, as predicted. There were no pictures. The news crews had been swept away by the storm surge. Of the 500 or so people who had decided to stay and brave the storm in Virginia Beach, 2 survivors were plucked from the water, and the story they told was that Virginia Beach was not just destroyed, it was completely gone. The storm had briefly moved back out to sea, intensifying again, then began to move up the coast. Looking outside, the sky was bright blue with white clouds, and the clouds were moving southwest at a rapid pace. Within hours, the sky began to change. The storm clouds moved in from the northeast. It meant they were on the northern reaches of the low that formed the center of the storm. Sometimes with tropical systems, it took days to move up the coast, but with this system, the movement was very rapid. Very soon after the storm clouds had moved in, they began to experience gale-force winds, and every now and then they could hear the crash of a tree coming down. At 3 p.m. on July 5th, the power went out, never to come on again. But before it went out, the cable went and all the signals for the cell phones. All they could get was the public service broadcast on a small battery-powered radio. It flashed the same warning over and over again. A strong Category 5 hurricane is going to make a direct hit on Baltimore and the surrounding area. You are advised to go to a higher place or seek shelter in a strong building. Then it listed emergency numbers, but the lines were long dead, including 911. By the time they had sustained winds of 100 miles an hour, they began to see strange blue lightning. The house began to shake as the winds intensified and the windows rattled. Even though it was a house built to waterfront standards for FEMA. Once they looked out, and the water and the sound was completely gone. It was the strangest sight. The winds had blown all of the water into the ocean. Then rainwater began to come through the ceiling. At 9 p.m., there was a sudden calm, and they went outside to survey the damage. The water and the sound was completely gone. Their eyes had not deceived them, and they could see stars overhead in the full moon. All of the houses on the small cove had sustained severe damage. The house next door had no roof, but the people in that house had had evacuated long before the storm hit. Most of the trees in the yards in the small forest behind were down. A Winnebago across the cove had been completely cut in half by a huge oak tree. Their house had lost most of the shingles, and they had put pans and buckets around to catch the constant flow of water, but they filled up too quickly to do any good. They knew the worst was still to come, and that they were in the eye. The calm did not last long, and within 30 minutes, the winds returned within seconds from the opposite direction and accelerated to full force. Then they felt the full blunt of the backside of a Category 5 hurricane. Shortly after the storm returned, they heard a roar that was louder than the storm, and it seemed to be building in intensity. At first, they thought it was a tornado that had been spawned by the hurricane. But as the intensity built, it had a strange, different sound, like a waterfall. It was deafening, and they realized it was the water returning to the sound driven by the winds. Within seconds, they were engulfed by water, and the house was swept from its foundation and carried with the tidal wave. The woman's next awareness was of being in surging water and holding onto a small tree trunk that kept trying to roll her under the water. Then it was dark for a while, except for the fleeting images of houses and debris being driven along beside her. At one point, a floating house was so close that it acted as a wind block, and she was afraid it would roll over her, but the current shifted into two streams, and the house moved away to her left. When she finally awoke, she was wedged between a tree and what appeared to be a garage roof. She knew they had saved her from being swept back when the ocean receded. It was calm now, except for a few sprinkles. Her left leg felt broken, but the pain was not intense. Mostly it felt numb. She went back to sleep, where she lay to wait for the dawn. She was exhausted. The woman had been 21 then. That was the day she stopped counting her age. It had been a long time ago, and when she still had been known as Allison. That had been her memory of the first storm. Its name escaped her, and even though the later storms were more damaging, this was her most intense memory of the summer of storms. The rescues never came, and by noon she knew she had to get help. Unwedging herself, she tried to stand up and saw she could put some pressure on the leg. She knew there was a hospital about a mile away, and within 2 hours she had negotiated the distance. But where the hospital had been, there was only web. Then she only remembered being in a second-floor apartment in the city. The next few days had been hazy, and only days later, just about the time she was getting her strength, the next storm hit. The woman thought back to the first victims of the plagues.